My name is Ashley Bigham. I'm an architect, and I'm co-director of Outpost office, a small architectural practice. We're currently based in Columbus, Ohio, but as the name suggests, we move around a lot and we work in a lot of different contexts. I think I had a very uninteresting transition into architecture. I think when I was in high school and growing up, I was very interested in creative things, making things, and I was trying to find a career path that allowed me to do that in a kind of structured way. And so I thought architecture might be it. I didn't know any architects. I'd never met an architect when I decided to become an architect. And so I just kind of took a leap of faith and went to architecture school at 18 years old. When I went to undergrad, I went to the University of Tennessee. I grew up in Tennessee. I'm from Tennessee. And so at that time in my life, that made perfect sense. I didn't look that much outside of Tennessee because there is a great accredited school of architecture there. And so that just seemed a kind of the normal next steps. I was from a very rural town in Tennessee. So, honestly, I didn't have a ton of exposure to what schools were out there. I'm very lucky that that's where I ended up because I had some amazing teachers there who really, really got me excited, and I ended up falling in love with architecture, even though I didn't know what it was when I started. Like nobody, really understands it until you get going in it. But I just feel so lucky that I kind of ended up at a great school with great teachers. And then later, after I had graduated and worked for a bit, I decided to go to grad school, which was at a point in my career where I knew a little bit more about different schools of architecture and what the options were and what options were available. And so then I went to Yale University for graduate school. I think my place of origin is rural Tennessee, from a town of 900 people, so very small. I went to a high school where I graduated with 50 people in my graduating class. And so I think always drove me to travel a lot after, to go to first a really large University of Tennessee, and then later to travel a lot of different places in the world, just to gain more exposure. And but I still love going back to Tennessee to visit. I grew up on a farm, and so there's a lot of lessons to be learned there, and a lot of understanding what it means to kind of get out and build something, to work really hard, to try to make an impact in the space that you're from. And so that's the space I'm from, my origin. But another space, and you were asking about kind of just spaces that are important to you, places that are important to you. And you mentioned our firm, Outpost office. So we were actually living in Europe when we named our office. We lived in Europe for 2 years. And for one of those years, I was living in Ukraine. I did a semester abroad in Poland when I was in undergrad, and then wanted to continue to study the region of Eastern Europe. And so did a Fulbright fellowship in Ukraine. And so that was a kind of intense experience in a culture that I grew to know a lot about, and also to love, and to become hopefully a part of in some way. And so that's been really formative for me as an architect, but also as a person, as an American, doing the Fulbright program. You're really representing America in some ways, and you're really there to kind of share culture with the host country. And so, and then of course, learn a lot about the host country. And so that's influenced a lot of the design that I've done since, and also just my kind of perspective on working globally, working remotely, and what it means to kind of work in a new context or an outpost. So when I was looking at grad schools, I knew that I wanted to teach architecture, and that was one reason I wanted to go to grad school. So I was looking at different grad schools that might, prepare me for academia, and also just challenge me in a way that maybe my previous university had not. And history and theory was a particular interest at Yale. And there were, many wonderful faculty that I wanted to study with and did study with. Dolores Hayden, who has written many books on the history of American suburbia, and also the history of women's contribution to whether it's city planning and design of utopias in America, or just different movements throughout history that women have been a big part of is very inspiring. Keller Easterling also was, I think, very influential. Took several of her seminars at Yale. And then as studio critics, I had wonderful studio critics as well. Todd Williams and Billy Chen were two that kind of stand out as being amazing teachers. But in general, Yale was such a great experience. There was also quite a few, opportunities for travel, again, that were either built into the studio context, or I did a course where we traveled to British Gardens. It's called History of British Landscapes. And we took a trip where we traveled to just amazing kind of formal gardens in England, which is, not something that I think is available at every school. And so that was a pretty unique opportunity. And again, always just kind of like looking outside of wherever I'm geographically located for, kind of inspiration, and also just to, again, expand my own understanding of architecture. A few really important mentors, and sometimes they're people I actually had classes with, and sometimes they were, maybe people I worked for in their firms, or people that are colleagues once I started teaching. And so I think mentorship is very important in architecture. There's so many things you learn on the job, but sometimes on the job is a little bit nebulous, like when are we on the job, when are we off of the job, especially when you're doing work with organizations or communities or things. And so, there have been many, many mentors, and we've tried to start doing that in our office as well. So when we have employees, we, consider ourselves, they're kind of, research partners in a way. And we try to make sure that we're also kind of mentoring younger architects as well. I had a couple of jobs. One, for a year before I went to graduate school, I worked at Moss. And so Michael Meredith and Hilary Sample, of course, the principals of Moss, I think were, very influential, just kind of understanding how to run a small practice, how you kind of organize that, how you stay really engaged in the design culture, teaching and building, how you sort of balance those things, and also writing, really amazing writers. And so, there were some, but again, as I mentioned, Keller Easterling, Dolores Hayden at Yale, even Bimal Mendez and Joy Swing at Yale. They were just, I kind of consider, in a way, I have so many, mentors, and now are kind of colleagues and friends. But yeah, I would say those are some. And then in the undergraduate experience, had a professor, Brian Ambrosiak, and Catherine Ambrosiak as well. These professors who, again, just were amazing, did amazing work with students, in that undergrad level, just getting them acclimated to what architecture is, and also just developing and nurturing that kind of lifelong passion for architecture, which is a hard thing to do, I think, as a teacher. It's something that I hope I'm doing, but they are people that I think really instilled that in me very young. Yeah. One thing that we're really excited about, was as important as mentors are to us as architects, like I think our colleagues and our peer group is also really important. So the work that Jennifer Bonner has done on housing, Sean Canty at Harvard does amazing work on housing as well. We're really a big fan of his work. Jermaine Barnes, who's also a participant at the Chicago Architecture Biennial with us, a collaborator, he's done good work on, thinking about the front porch or the stoop in Chicago and what that means for housing. Lots of our colleagues and friends are working on this, and that's really exciting because we all approach the project of American housing slightly differently. And so we think a lot about the kind of family unit, the non-nuclear family unit, or, again, the more common family units than that. And so we're interested in a kind of non-single family home, and what does it mean to be a single family, and probably like nobody actually, that's not a term that's useful anymore. And so we're working on some, duplex projects, or projects where various units are flexible over many years, thinking more about kind of life cycle of a building rather than a kind of particular commodification of architecture in the real estate terms, which is, I think, a kind of big problem in the US right now. So since we are university professors as well, we kind of operate on an academic schedule in some ways. So what is a typical day in June is probably very different than a typical day in September, as you know. But that's one thing that I really like about my job, is that I always wanted something where I wasn't in an office the 9 to 5, every day of the year. I wanted something that kind of changed. And so we are much more kind of project focused. So while there's the kind of, August to May academic calendar where we're more teaching, but at least 1 or 2 days a week, we're really working on Outpost office work, which is our academic research. But then also, in the summertime, we'll often do much more design work. We'll maybe have a few employees in the office. We'll kind of grow our office and shrink our office along with the academic calendar. So in the summer, we'll grow, and then in the fall, we might shrink again. But we're always kind of working project to project in that way. And so we will, projects range from 3-year long projects to 4-month long projects, especially if they're exhibition projects or temporary projects. For example, we're in Chicago this week to open at the Chicago Architecture Biennial. So, this is a project really we've been working on kind of all summer leading up to this big opening in September. So again, it kind of ebbs and flows as far as like what a typical day is, but it's some writing, some teaching, some emails, some designing, some drawing, some emails again, right? So Eric and I had been collaborating on, a design competition here and there for a year or two before we decided to kind of officially, start Outpost Office and collaborate full time on our work. And so I think that just kind of happened very naturally. We didn't even have to there was no big decision. It just sort of started to happen. We started to collaborate more and more. Then we started to say, we need a kind of name and identity for this collaboration, knowing that, we would bring people in, or we would partner with other firms, or we would, again, kind of establish Outpost Office distinct from maybe my specific research or his specific research, but Outpost Office would be this kind of collective research, which I think is very healthy, when you're starting something, to separate it slightly sometimes from your own personal work in a way. And so I think just even that kind of mental shift of naming the office was a big moment where it was just, okay, we're going to start this project now, and this is going to be a lifelong project as well. Currently, if we look at the projects that Outpost Office is working on and has done in the past few years, we kind of see 2 strains of thought in our work. One is collective spaces for gathering. And so that's a lot of the work that we've done here at the Chicago Architecture Biennial and at the Ragdale Foundation. A lot of times those projects, our most recent sort of tool for creating collective spaces for gathering is a robot. So we've been doing urban paintings using robotics. And so that's kind of where we took ideas and interests that we had about space making and architecture, and we took a tool, a piece of technology that we knew existed, but we also knew architects weren't at all using it or maybe even aware of it. And we tried to merge these 2 ideas together. And we've come up with these series of projects that we continue to do, because each time we learn something really new about the way people use public space, the way people spontaneously gather, activities that people do on painted surfaces, how color and pattern changes those activities or the response to them. Actually, at the site here, we've now been thermal scanning the site and looking at how different colors are actually affecting the temperature on the site, which in the summer in Chicago, there was I think about a 10-degree difference between parts of the site after we had painted and kind of changed that. So we're looking at now at what could be the really positive effects of this beyond kind of, getting people excited about the space or revitalizing it or, making a fresh basketball court on the site, things like that. And the other strain of work that we look at in the office is on American housing. And so this goes back to some of my interests also with suburbia and things I was studying at Yale, and then after in my fellowship at the University of Michigan. And so in American suburbia, or American housing in general, we're very interested in how we as architects can impact in and participate in positive changes given the current housing crisis, given the the focus on the single family home in America as the main source of housing, when really that type of housing doesn't work for many people, and it's created a lot of inequality as well. And so we're really interested in new forms of housing in America, and we're working on a couple of houses that explore the non-nuclear family. So I think in our office we often see architecture, I think you asked earlier, like kind of how you start a project. So a lot of times we have things that we've been working on in the office, be they scripts, software, ways of creating form, drawings, games, that are always kind of running in the background, a little bit, kind of like an algorithm. And so a lot of times when we start a project, we kind of look at all of these experiments, say design experiments that we've been doing. And a lot of those are more, script based, or they're somehow kind of formal games that we look at. And I think that's how the interest kind of in robotics started. And, it was something, again, when we see a technology that is underutilized by architects, but we see has a big spatial impact, I think that's where we get really excited. So any kind of not exactly off the shelf, but it is a robot which is made more at a kind of end consumer. So we're less interested in designing and building our own robots. That's not what we do. We're very interested in taking the kind of standardized special robot and then applying it, misusing it, treating it differently. So the robot we have actually paints sports fields, which is very good at painting a soccer field or a football field or a baseball diamonds, but it had never been tested to paint anything like what we were painting with it. And so we said, wow, that's an amazing technology, but it seems quite specific. I bet there's a lot more that we could do with that would have really big spatial impacts. And we're always trying to also think about architectural labor and how we can kind of be more specific about our labor, our labor on the site, fabrication labor. We're always trying to kind of cut that down. And so this robotics tool allowed us to really think about fabricating in a COVID era as well, with a smaller team of people, but still having a really big impact on a space. So my undergraduate was a 5-year Bachelor of Architecture program. So after that, I didn't necessarily have to go to grad school to be a licensed architect. But I remember in my 5th year, I started to think about what I would like my day-to-day life to look like. What type of architect would I want to be? Would I work in a really large corporate office? Do I want to work on really big scale buildings, urban design, landscape? Like how did I want to see myself? And I really started to look at that again, kind of cycle and daily work of my professors. and I started to say, wow, that's actually an amazing way to engage architecture, right? To teach the next generation of students, but to also have a practice. So many architects are able to balance that. And that balance is, again, challenging at times, definitely challenging, but it's so fruitful and it's so exciting, and it keeps me interested, I think. And so that kind of back and forth balance, I think, thinking about kind of making a long career in architecture, always knowing that at any moment, I can kind of do more of the practice or do a little more of the teaching, and that it's always this kind of back and forth, started to be very appealing to me. And then I think after working in an architecture office for a few years, I think that became even more clear that I wanted that type of work, the more, mixing in kind of, short-term projects with with teaching. And then we have some, building projects in Outpost office that are, again, that more kind of typical architectural scale of you work on a house for 2 or 3 years, before it's constructed. So that way we're kind of working at all scales, which is great. When you're a student, you often do kind of teaching fellowships, or you help out with different classes, or you teach high school summer camps for architects, and things like that. All of those sorts of things, again, to kind of test out and try to see if you're really interested in it. I think those are great. And so I did a few of those. And then after we lived in Europe and I came back to the US, I was applying for various fellowship positions. And so I did an architectural fellowship at the University of Michigan, which they have a fellowship program where they bring in recent grads and they give you a platform to research and a little funding to have an exhibition, and you also teach classes. And so again, it's a kind of 1-year commitment from the university to you and you to the university. But at the end of that 1 year, you can really decide, do you want to go back into practice? Do you want to continue into teaching? And so I did that for a year, and it was a really wonderful experience. And so ended up staying at University of Michigan for 3 years teaching, and then moved to Ohio State University to take a tenure track position to again make a longer commitment to a single university. So my role has changed a little bit from being a kind of 1-year research fellow to now a full-time faculty who also has works in the Outpost office work into that lifestyle. So it's very interesting. In 2019, Outpost office did a collaboration with the Archivo School of Architecture, which is in Ukraine, and we did a short design build workshop. It was actually 6 weeks, but we did a 6-week design build workshop with students there. And that was a completely kind of new experience because, as you're suggesting, doing fabrication projects in the US, we have certain tools and technology available. And as soon as you're in a different location, served by different supply chains, global supply chains, even something as simple as sourcing materials is very different, right? So in that project, we were sourcing all of our materials and tools and techniques from local bazaars, so open air city bazaars, where we were actually purchasing things from vendors who sold products to other vendors, so a kind of wholesale market. So we were going to a wholesale market, which that impacted the way we worked more than I ever thought it would, actually. And it's something I've been writing about now, is the kind of way you work within a global supply chain, which is actually very, very specific. So if we think about our work in the US, we're relying on 3 or 4, major companies, Lowe's, Home Depots, or Menards in the Midwest. You're always kind of working with these standard building materials, as all architects are very, very aware of. But as soon as you kind of change contexts, if those supply chains change, the way that you work is very different. But on the other side, working with Ukrainian students, their wood shop looks very similar to our wood shop. They have 3-axis mills, they have, laser cutters, they have all sorts of woodworking tools, and a lot of great construction skills, actually, that sometimes even our American students don't have. So, there are these kind of differences, but again, in each place, what we're trying to get very good at is actually just adapting to the tools and the techniques and the materials that are available in that location, and really figuring out how we work within that system instead of trying to kind of work against that system and say, okay, we only work with robots. So if you don't have a robot, we don't work with, we're much more interested in being very flexible and saying, okay, what do you have? What are you good at? And let's work with that. I've definitely noticed there are definitely generational trends in architecture in the US. And I think what you're describing is really good for the discipline. I think it's really good for talent and resources and opportunities to be spread across the country, right? I think because a lot of students, again, like me, when I chose architecture at 18, they don't know anything about what school they should go to for architecture, or maybe like an Ivy League school has never even entered the realm of possibility for them, as it never did for me at 18. Just not a thing I could even conceive of. And I think that's great. That's good. Like, we need really talented, wonderful professors all over the US. We need great students, as they are spread out in all sorts of cities, with lots of different backgrounds, coming from large cities, tiny towns. Like, we need that diversity in architecture. And so while I think sometimes the older generation is laments some sort of loss of something, I think it's really good for architecture, and I hope we're a part of that change, and I hope we're always kind of looking again to architects and students younger than us and trying to kind of help them, trying to elevate them, let them know about job openings, or let them know about opportunities, about grants, about scholarships, about things that are available, because I think there is a lot available. And I think this is where also kind of social media network is great for this. I think when I was in school, there was very little kind of professional social media interaction. You might have had Facebook, but Instagram wasn't as much of a place for finding opportunities, but also just finding like affinities. If you are a student in Kansas and you see students in Ohio doing similar work with shared similar interests, I can imagine that's really exciting, right? To not feel isolated, but to feel like you're a part of this big community of architects in the US, but also abroad. That's the other amazing thing, is that it connects us to schools in Canada, or schools in Mexico, or schools in Europe. It really kind of expands the network for all of us. But I think the students are particularly good at finding those affinities. This is such a tough question, because there are so many things that were hard to learn that are so useful. And I think I think finding some design as a process is, there are some universals, and then there are some specificities to the individual designer. I think something in our office we've been working on, and I think we're getting much better at, is working on projects, switching to other projects, coming back to this project and looking at them with fresh eyes. I think that's really important. Sometimes you need to throw away a bad idea, but if you worked on that idea for a long time, it's really hard to do. I see this again, something I try to teach the students as well. If something's not working, it's okay to let it go and move on to the next thing. As far as different design ideas, and when you're starting out in a project, for example, but that's a hard thing to learn. So that's just one of, I think, many things. I think for the future, there are many things. I hope that this, I really want to continue to always be learning something about architecture. But I think one thing in the future is that, Outpost Office, we're doing several building projects currently at the moment. So, in the next few years, we're doing a couple of ground up buildings. And so I don't even think I can tell you what the lessons learned from those will be, but I absolutely know that there will be a lot of lessons. And I'm looking forward to, making a few mistakes along the way, because we will inevitably do that. But the main thing is that if we make a mistake, that we learn from it, right? And then it's no longer a mistake. It was just an opportunity. It was a test, and it was an experiment. And so we try to think of everything as an open-ended experiment, where there are kind of no wrong answers, but there are things we're going to try.